What is the relationship? There's just two more things I want to cover with you in the last couple of minutes.
Sure.
So one is, okay, there's this media campaign against Sanders. What is actually happening on the ground in this campaign when Bernie Sanders actually goes out and interacts with actual voters?
Well, I don't begrudge you for not knowing that, Michael, because you don't get very much of a view of what's going on. But the crowds that we're seeing are massive, just like they were in 2016. And just like in 2016, they're being ignored. And the media is going to, I think, find themselves in for another one of these Oopsie Days of surprise moments. Bernie Sanders was in California last week. And even though we have seen this happen again and again, I wasn't in California, but every staff member who staffed the event who came back was like, even I was surprised by the magnitude of how these things are growing. Right? Like, when I got off the train, when I went to the Hahnemann Hospital protest a few weeks ago in Philadelphia, we were there trying to prevent this closure of a hospital that serves 50% Black and brown, majority, 2/3 Medicaid recipient, low-income hospital that they're closing because a venture capitalist has purchased it to sell it for condos. I get off the train in a Bernie shirt, which I normally don't wear, more because of my sartorial preferences than anything else. And this, a black cab driver in the line, as we walk out of the place, immediately starts shouting, "Bernie, that's the guy. That's my guy." If you, the whole day, as you walk around the city in Bernie attire, you realize that the people who throw their fists up, I was sitting in a hotel lobby. I just randomly chosen a hotel lobby using their Wi-Fi until I was waiting for my train. And a young white guy who was on the janitorial staff threw up a fist at me when he saw my shirt. Like, it's really clear who it is that supports Bernie Sanders. We are leading with working class voters, non-college educated voters, Black and brown voters, something, again, that the media doesn't talk about. And that is entirely reflected in what we perceive when we move through the world. And these are also people who don't have landlines and aren't getting polled, right? No one can afford just to have a $20 a month extra charge for a landline when you're only going to use it when some disaster happens and the phones go down. These people are often not voters, not people who voted previously, right? These people are not getting captured either by the media or by the polls. And so, it can be dispiriting, and I want to anybody who's listening who feels dispirited by the media narratives or the polling, et cetera, I just really want to remind you that, anytime that I start to get a little in the doldrums, the second I'm out on the road, even in a room full of, journalists at NABJ who you might suspect, okay, they're more of an elite crowd, they have some privilege under their belt, all right. They're young, they're Black, they're millennial, they got it.
Mm-hmm. They love Bernie.
The people who have a material reason to support Bernie, as you would expect, still do. And we are not, this kind of narrative that we are sharing voters or competing with voters for voters with Elizabeth Warren. It just doesn't pan out by the polls and the research.
Can you elaborate that a little bit? Because every time, look, I think it is important, frankly, at some point in a look, the collegiality and respectfulness between Sanders and Warren is great. And, but at some point, if it comes to that, I think, certainly I feel comfortable talking about the just very clear distinctions that exist there. And, primarily, again, that's really a sort of media war. I don't hear either of the campaigns saying that they're, the same thing. I see that as, if anything, if I was Senator Warren or worked on her campaign, I would actually, I might see the sort of short-term benefit in all of the anti-Sanders bias, but I would be worried about the future and actually, frankly, kind of angry that some really important and interesting work is basically just, often puffed up just to sort of juxtapose against Sanders. So it's really in many ways just a media, fundamentally a media critique. But what hit, but digging into those numbers, I think that is really important. Like, his base and her base right now look very, very different. And to the extent to which those distinctions are going to matter, it matters again in terms of a media narrative that feeds a lot of false equivalencies and profound dishonesty about the Sanders record and what this campaign represents. That, as I say, it just isn't even like it's the best campaign. It's just a different kind. It really is a different thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's my thing. I think it's the way to go 100%. But we're not talking about relatively better in a sort of same scale because you guys are doing something different. It's a different proposition.
Yeah, and this is a little bit what we were talking about in this week's episode. The mass movement piece that Jon Favreau picked up on as the distinguishing factor, for me, is why I'm sitting here on this campaign, and I would not have left the job that I love for in any other.
Right.
And it comes down to this. I was having a conversation, an off-the-record conversation with a journalist, and they were telling me about, they said, I'm broadly a member of the Bernie Warren wing of the Democratic Party, but I think I'm leaning toward Warren. And I said, okay, may I ask why? And they basically expressed that there was a policy. This person, is has kind of a similar background as that I do,
mm-hmm.
In terms of education and schooling and things like that. So they said, well, I'm really into some of these technocratic fixes. There's this, she basically has this policy about, I think it was venture capital. It was some policy that had to do with regulating, high risk elite financial transactions
mm-hmm.
that he was just really geeking out over because it's something that related to his own personal scholarship and background. And I said, I really appreciate that. That is a perfectly legitimate thing to like. She, has a kind of a expertise with the regulatory sector, which nobody would deny her. And, that's a perfectly credible reason to like her.
Mm-hmm.
But let me ask you this. Do you think that if she runs on those kinds of things, do you think that the average American is going to pull a lever next fall based on her policy with respect to hedge funds or whatever it is?
Right.
Do you think that's going to be the motivating issue? And it's not that those things aren't enormously important and that the Bernie Sanders campaign doesn't also have, a great deal of attention paid to regulatory matters. I mean, this is what was a backbone of the campaign back in 2016. But the question is about framing and your ability to connect with myriad Americans and identify what those shared interests are that can inspire a revolution of people who aren't just kind of charmed by what's been put on the table policy-wise, but feel an investment in fighting for them such that they will not only vote, they will get 10 of their friends to vote, and once you are in office, they will continue to persist to pressure their local representatives in order to make sure that the policies that the candidate ran on actually come to fruition. And if their local representatives don't, that they're going to vote them out of office because their lives depend on it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And again, I did identify in the opening commentary, there is, Bernie says not me, us. And that is because the constituent parts of how a Sanders administration would govern already exist now. They're being built now. That's the fact that you guys use your email list to actually intervene for states where reproductive justice is, women are under attack in a fundamental way, to warn people about the ICE raids and so on. And I have to say, I mean, and as I've seen other, frankly, not just Warren, I've seen other candidates, as with all the other issues now, they're trying to, now they're subtly and not so subtly emulating Sanders' argument with regard to a movement. Mm-hmm. And it's like, in the Warren case specifically, I just would say, please watch the tension between she has a plan and will build a movement. That's not a synthesis. That's really contradictory. And not me, us is a through line that is coherent and fits together as a campaign and as a potential government to actually deliver what we really desperately need.
I obviously agree. We are of one mind on this, Michael.
And two great minds they are, Bri. Can I just one more minute, just for people who do, because there's some people in my audience, and I will say, people who are and people have all sorts of different types of time, and I get it. I'm not telling anybody anything to do, but the people I know who have had a little bit more engagement with the campaign, maybe they're making a few phone calls or whatever, they feel a lot more optimistic. And then I think that there's other people that, you know, they're news consumers and they're getting this like relentless drumbeat that Sanders is in trouble. And it's funny to me because you know, look, I'm not Pollyannish. I want it to be even better, obviously. And I have I have some thoughts. Maybe we'll talk about some other time about how maybe it could or whatever. But I will say this: when I see this relentless media drumbeat against Sanders, I read it as like their version of like The Secret, like their vision boarding. Like if we just repeat it enough and say it enough and visualize it enough and ignore enough polls and put him out enough headlines, him and all of these tens of millions of people just go away. And so I actually see it as that they're totally freaked out and they're doing like, you know, new age visualization exercises on this. You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.